Hey, Sarah,
Hey,
how you doing?
pretty good. Just at the end of my day and excited to talk.
So do you want to go over first I want to start with your model of context, content, and concern. Do you want to go over that and then we can go into some other stuff that you might be more interested in talking about?
Sure. Do you want me to introduce myself, or are you going to do that in the show
Sure,
notes?
you can I was gonna get to your like biographical stuff at some point, but yeah, we can do that right now if you like. Sure.
Okay, just checking. Yeah, I do both work in authentic relating and on conflict and on leadership training within the frame of kind of playful experience design and um, how do we really make practical a lot of the philosophical models that we have, especially
Hmm.
in Gambi and um, rational thought. So the model that you spoke to, context, content, concern, we talk about in our Art of Difficult Conversations class. It's the idea that in any conversation, we have content, which is what I'm talking about right now. So that could be the information that we have that might differ from each other. It could be the perspectives we have, the assumptions we're making. When two people are upset with each other, this is what they're yelling at each other with, like, you did this, no, you did this is correct, no, this is correct. That's the content of a conversation. Um, Underneath that, we have concerns. Most of the time, this is really what we're speaking about. I was coaching somebody today that was talking about a conflict that she had with her brother, and there's a point in the conflict where her brother seemed like he was talking about a pretty innocent issue, but when she pushed back, he blew up and got suddenly really angry. That usually happens when there's an unexpressed concern. Like maybe in his head, he was worried about her judging him. And so that was percolating underneath the surface, and the content touched it. Concerns or values that we hold, their identities, their beliefs, they're the things that we care about, our hopes and our fears. If somebody is talking about their belief that Trump would make a great president, for instance, and you push back saying, like, here's what I think about Trump's policies, what they really may be saying is something like, I'm scared that if the Democrats win, some of my personal freedoms are going to be taken away.
Hmm.
And you can address things more on that level instead of like, well, why is it that you follow Trump? What matters to you about his arguments? Why are you like, why do you feel upset when I push on this thing? Is there a story that you have? Is there a moment that affected you? Is there a value you hold? And then context is the kind of conversation we're having. It's like the frame that we see everything through. Um, so, for instance, if I think that we're having a civil discussion around what candidates we support, and you think that we're having a conversation where one of us is trying to convince the other of the rightness of our beliefs, like I think it's just like, oh, we're having a philosophical discussion that doesn't really mean anything. And you're like, there's a lot at stake in this discussion. We need to convince each other. We have different contexts, and that really affects things. It can really change the frame of a discussion. It can be valuable at some point in a discussion to stop and go, wait a second. Like for me, this is pretty low stakes. For you, like, do you feel like I'm trying to convince you of something? Do you feel like uh, this is even the right conversation to have? It seems like we've gotten really off track from what it is that we've talked about.
Hmm.
So it's three different places that you can look at what is happening in conversations, especially difficult conversations, to find leverage points. Like maybe you need to deliver this person new information to change their mind or check what information they have. Maybe you need to explore what are the concerns that they're holding or explain the concerns you're holding in the argument. And maybe you need to change the context so you're both clear on what exactly it is you're talking about and why.
Hmm. Does this like borrow from like integral theory, or where did you get this idea most from? Like, um,
The sections of like in mediation, one of the classic models is interests versus positions. So
mhm,
positions are oftentimes the content that we have, and the interests are the concerns underlying it. I was also thinking about the idea of how much frame influences our discussions, like the way that we see the world, which is intangible. It's really hard to see. I think it's one of the things that Game B is often pointing at of like, hey, there's this substrate of beliefs and expectations and thoughts that underlie our interactions, and we could change the game. Changing the game is putting in place a new context. And it's something that we think about less. We don't think about, well, how could we change, even change where we're having a conversation? Like physical location can be a frame. What we're wearing can be a frame. What frame we've set on the conversation. Where that particular naming of it came from, I was on a Vipassana retreat, and I was like at day 5 or 6 of it, and laying in my bed at like 4 a.m. when we woke up for the meditation bell, and all of a sudden my brain was like, context, content, concern. That seems to make sense. I should remember that.
Yeah.
And then I got lucky because you're not allowed notebooks at Vipassana. So I was like, either I'm gonna remember this or not.
So when you talk about like whether something is true, you're talking about, I guess, epistemology and ontology. And when you're talking about is it necessary, um, is there like a net benefit out of it? And then is it kind? Is it in touch with other people's uh I guess wants, desires? Um, can you get into that a little bit more and break that down? And
The idea of true, necessary, and kind.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, I mean, it's kind of like the three gates of Buddhism idea, which is a little bit different, but I see this as like the three gates that you can check your speech by. Of is it true? Like, if you're having trouble figuring out, should I say this thing? Like, I have a thought that's going through my head as this person is speaking. And I use difficult conversations as my usual models because that's where we have the most difficulty,
Mm-hmm.
um, and run into the most polarization. Um, I'm having a thought go through my head while someone else is talking. Say I think they're intolerant, and I'm like, I want to speak up about this. I'm not comfortable about what they're saying. Um, one of the things I want to check is like, at this point in time, is it necessary for me to say something? Like, do I know yet exactly what this person is saying? Like, am I sure of what their argument is? Maybe I don't need to say anything because they're actually going to talk themselves out of it, or because I'm not totally sure what argument they're making yet. Um, Maybe it's not the right time and place for the thing. These are all subjective, of course, but it's good to check in that moment. Um, is what I'm going to say like useful for this time and place? And what is it necessary for? Even checking the goal. Like, is it necessary for me to feel self-expressed? Is it necessary for other people to feel safe in this situation or to feel like their views are able to be heard? Is it necessary because there's actually an outcome that we're orienting towards together that's not happening? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's necessary because we're in a board meeting and my boss has started kind of berating a colleague and I want to speak up about it. Well, maybe it's necessary in order to preserve the health of my team.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then another thing I can check is it true? And this one's more complicated, right? Because truth is so often subjective.
Mm-hmm.
But I mostly use this one to check, like, am I going overboard in what I'm saying? Am I about to do hyperbole? Am I about to make an assertion that I know is not totally correct? In arguments, often, I'm sure we've all experienced this. It's like you go off for like 5 minutes on explaining what it is that you see and what somebody else has done, what really matters to you, and you're really impassioned about it. You're like, I really deeply care about our relationship and the connection that we're having. And the other day, when you forgot to call, and tell me that you were going to be out all evening, I was really hurt about it. And this has happened a couple times before. And every time it happens, you like, really bare your soul. And you finish that whole thing, and the other person goes, it hasn't happened a couple times before. It's only happened twice. And that entire thing that you said is just lost.
Mm-hmm.
So, being as specific as possible whenever we can, and doing as much kind of naming things in objective ways and speaking to what we know is true is in part a way to preserve the value of honesty in the world and more good information being out there. And in part, it's instrumental value people push back less when you're specific and when they can't fight the words that you're using, when your sources are cited, when your stories are personal to your experience, which is something that can't be argued. So that's the truth. And then is it kind is like there are so many things we could say. And this is something where I put my foot in my mouth a lot personally. Like often with my husband, I will
Mhm.
say something without thinking. Um, like I pulled a can of he'd made some tomato soup the other day and it made me stomach sick. Through no fault of his, I was already sick with COVID, and I think there was something in it that aggravated me. And I pulled the container out of the fridge yesterday, and I was like, what is this? He was like, it's tomato soup. I was like, oh yeah, the soup that made me sick. And he had to sit down and he'd be like, okay, it's true that that made you sick, but it was neither like necessary nor kind to say that in the moment. Like I spent time making this for you. You
Mhm.
could have said something like, oh, that's the soup that like I really loved. Like I appreciate that you made it for me. Also, I think it made me sick. Like I was not kind in the way that I delivered it, and so it
Mhm.
had a negative effect on my relationship. And I also didn't think about whether that was something I needed to say or what the effect on him would be. So both all of these, one of the things that they do is they slow us down. They basically force us before we speak to take a second and think, what do I want the impact of my words to be? What concern am I of mine or of my values am I trying to fulfill right now? And are my words going to get me to that or get me closer to that?
How do we know when we are like overindulging in that though, or being too like concerned about how our words come across versus um actually having like the proper view of that and not just having like a OCD anxiety loop of, oh, did I say the right thing to this person, or you
Uh-huh.
know what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you
Um,
have
yeah,
an
well,
answer?
I
Like, how do
definitely
you check
have that.
yourself?
I'm prone to anxiety of different kinds, but certainly when I'm navigating relationships, or especially if it's somebody I really care about or admire or don't understand what they're thinking, then I might overthink. Did I say the right thing? Did I come across the right way? I'm definitely an overthinker. So, yeah, I'm
Mhm.
asking largely for personal reasons, but it's a general question. I think it could apply to many people too. So,
Yeah, it's a
yeah,
great question. Um, let's see. How do you know? It's almost the question of like, how do you know when you've done it enough? And you can kind of go back and stop going back and judging yourself. Is
yes.
that it?
Or be more present with the person rather than
Mm,
being concerned or being self-conscious, like being conscious of other people being conscious of you, sort of thing. I don't know.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I would put this in the mode of like, where is your attention when you're speaking to someone else? So
Mm-hmm.
self-consciousness is literally consciousness of the self.
Mm-hmm.
When we're self-conscious, usually we're more aware of ourselves and our thoughts and our feelings and our opinions than we are of the other person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if we're only aware of the other person, then we can become kind of hyper fixated and anxious about like each of the little movements about what they're paying attention to, right? And how
Mm-hmm.
they're responding to us. There's something about having, and if we're angry, we're kind of not conscious of anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like it may seem like we're the most conscious of what we're thinking and feeling, but I think most of the time when we're angry, we're a little bit dissociated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like we're not in that space at all. To me, it's like if you are able to keep some attention on yourself and some on the other person, or at least move your attention back and forth, which is a thing to train. Generally speaking, it's easier to not be as self-conscious. You're like, okay, what am I thinking and feeling? What is this other person talking about? How do I think the effect is going to be on them? But then let me just try it. Like, let me say something, let me notice their reaction to it. Because a lot of the time, what happens is we say something, and then instantly all of our attention goes back into ourselves. We're like, oh my God, what did I say? Like, did I screw that up? Did I say the wrong thing? We're not even noticing the way the other person responded to it.
Mm-hmm.
So you put something out there, you're like, oh, okay, Thomas said, it seems like he's responding to what I said. He's nodding a little bit. He looks like maybe a little like he's taking it in and considering it. Oh, okay. Like, seems like it went across. Maybe I need to explain it a little bit more. I could do that inside my own head. I could just be like, oh, I said that thing. He's not going to enjoy it at all. And then I spin out almost before the effect happens.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. So you can definitely get in a loop of being too pedantic about something and then not checking in with what is actually going on. Yeah, I see where you're going with that. Going more towards your um I guess you distinguishing psychological comfort and psychological safety. Do you want to get into that and why that's important?
um, sure. And it kind of even attaches to what we were just talking about, that
Yeah, yeah, certainly.
for when you get into loops of thought, like say you propose an unpopular view
Hmm.
and other people around you might have a negative response to that. Psychologically, that might be uncomfortable. Um, whether or not it's psychologically safe depends on the level of potential reaction to it. Oftentimes we confuse these two things. We're like, well, I need to feel psychologically safe when I'm in environments. And we say that as like, I like safety is that nobody is going to negatively react to the things that I say. We get
Hmm.
this a lot in the kind of more victim focused culture these days. Like, is it a safe space? And
Hmm.
safe is usually defined as that of like, no one is going to judge me, no one is going to react negatively to me. And it means that when other people do react negatively, we react almost as if someone has violated our boundaries. We're like, I was just expressing myself. How could you get mad at me for that? This isn't a safe space anymore.
Hmm.
And it's kind of dumb because everyone has different views and opinions. We have different concerns. We have different things that we consider kind to say. And you can't stop people from rubbing up against each other's edges. Uh, I was reading this great book by Scott Peck, who does a lot of research, did a lot of research in like the 1960s or so on community building. And he talks about the idea of pseudo community as the first stage of a group in which everyone is like not actually forming a community with each other or forming cohesion. They're just being really nice to each other so they don't like strike up against each other's edges. And then
Yeah.
once they do, the community falls into chaos, and you have this phase of like what's storming with each other, what Bruce Tuckman would call storming,
Hmm.
um, until you eventually get to this kind of like, okay, we've rubbed on each other's edges so much, and now we have to figure out what is next. But most of the time, what happens is that as soon as that rupture occurs, people are like, oh my gosh, we have to shut it down. Something bad happened. It's
And
not psychologically safe.
what is the I guess the way it manifests storming, is it similar to like cycles of abuse or something like that? Or is it like does it go through the valuation, devaluation kind of process of I guess cyclical like I don't know, narcissistic abuse for an example? Or is it just people get fed up with like the pseudo kindness, like the niceness, politeness, and they realize it's just a a veneer and then they lash out like how do you know how it functions in those communities or is it
I can say how I've seen it. Um, Peck describes it like he says he sees it most when somebody starts trying to give somebody else advice or help somebody else or judge somebody else.
Mhm.
I've seen it most in groups and trainings I've led when just when like dissonant opinions start to come out and people start to get frustrated at each other. They start to feel the first negative emotions. When people are together for the first time, there's this like transpersonal connection. There's this blush of like, wow, other humans. Like these are people that maybe share the same identity as me, for instance, if it's a group that's come together, like
Mhm.
rationalists or um, of a particular political spectrum or,
Mhm.
you know, Aspie folks, whatever it is. you're like, there's this not false cohesion, but like sense of connection that has almost nothing to do with who we are and more the selves we present and the labels we bear. And then you'll have a conversation with someone and you'll be like, oh man, I really liked this person, but actually their political opinions are super dissonant to mine. And you start carrying this kind of judgment and discomfort about it. And maybe you interact with that person later and it comes out sideways or it comes out in a different way. Um, and and one place this shows up that I think Peck is noticing that's really common in groups is that one person thinks another is being harmed and tries to protect them. Like, say the facilitator isn't calling on someone a couple times and someone else raises their hand and they're like, hey, I think this person wants to speak. Or, hey, facilitator, I feel like you're really missing something in the room. And then you get this tension starting to build. And what it really is like groups for the first time are experiencing dissonance, are experiencing discomfort, and we've been told that that feeling means that something is going to break or something's going to go wrong. That someone having a different viewpoint than us and expressing it is going to mean that our viewpoint, for instance, is not going to be heard. And
And
so, and
sorry,
it's like
I,
multiplied by the number of people because everybody's then reacting to everybody else's thing, and then you start getting people taking sides, um, and thinking that their viewpoint is the one that's not being represented. They're like, wow, I must be the only person in the room that cares about, you know, the value of safety or whatever, and everyone else is against me. And then someone else is like, no, I actually care about this other value. And you get this butting of heads. There's a game you can do that's really fascinating in these moments called Spectrum, which
mhm,
is you say, okay, everybody with this viewpoint, like say everybody with the viewpoint that the container isn't being held safely enough. If it's like a personal growth workshop or something, go to this side of the room. Okay, everybody who is of the opinion that it's actually being held like a little bit too safely, go to this side of the room, and people can be anywhere in between.
mhm,
And you start seeing this kind of people start getting how diverse the range of viewpoints is, and that both sides can be held and everything in the middle can be held, and that like it's not that people have to protect against each other, it's just that they're having different experiences, and it really lowers the level of tension in a room.
mhm. So you talk about like how that relates. You mentioned it already in this conversation, like the victim, or victim culture. Um, why do you think we have such or at least we might be coming to the tail end of it, or it's manifesting differently now, at least. But with I guess woke ideology, and then the right has its own versions of it. Um, why do you think victimhood became so glorified in our culture in, let's say, the last 10 years? Like, what do you think led to that?
Hmm. I'm not very good at tracking larger social trends, like not as good as a lot of the sense makers that are out there these days. Um, if I had to individuate some of the reasons, I think there's an underlying level of stress in our world right now that is kind of pervading everything. Like, and this is true to some extent, has definitely happened before in other generations when we've had wars and when we've had plagues and stuff, but it's happening more and more so in our generation as environmental decay occurs more with the advent of AI, um, with kind of democracies falling into more chaos, a change in the political spectrum, kind of across the world in some ways, which I think is also as much a cause as it is a symptom. And we tend to see more division and polarization and embitteredness in times like that. So I think that's one contributing factor. Um, and another is there's a breakdown of social norms and morals, and I know this makes me sound like a 1970s preacher, but we don't have a lot of the moral structures that we used to fall back on. We're not taught them by the church. Our parents, as a general rule, have decreased the amount of um, like tight parenting and punishment, I think, than they used to. Like it's not as much in style as it was definitely in our parents' and grandparents' generation.
Hmm.
So we're not instilled as many clear, like this is how the world works by our parents. We're with a very wide variety with people from different cultures a lot of the times. And so we're seeing all sorts of different social norms and values. Um, we have the pandemic, which kind of threw everything up in the air, especially for kids. And then we don't have the structures like the church that used to give clear guidelines on morality. And we're living in such big cities that we're not getting kind of, it used to be that morality was enforced by the fact that if you screwed someone else over, then the whole village knew it. Like there was an impact on you, it came back on you. But that's not the case now either. So it's like all of the underpinnings of this is how people act, and this is what creates a society where altruism and mutual respect and mutual good deeds are the norm, has kind of flown out the window at the same time as capitalism has been increasing more and more.
Hmm.
So we have this society in which, like, in a way, like might makes right, and the person that shouts the loudest and has the biggest experience gets the most attention because of social media. And one of the easiest ways to get attention is to play on emotions, and victims play on emotions. It tugs on people's heartstrings. They're speaking to loud emotional experiences. And because there's no social norms around, hey, you shouldn't say things that aren't fully true, or hey, this might be having a negative effect on someone else, there's no checks on it anymore.
Hmm. So, given that, in this time where everything, or not everything, but a lot of cultures functioning around victimhood, how do we decipher whether we're dealing with someone who is a true victim or just weaponizing the idea of, like, how do we recognize earnest victimhood and come to somebody compassionately and know when to put a boundary and realize somebody is just trying to guilt us or control us or manipulate us? Um, how do you navigate those things in like personal conflicts, for an example? If someone's using an identity category to like push you over, like I can kind of get into like the kick me thing you talk about, but um yeah, just do you want to unpack that?
I can try. I'm
Yeah.
curious how you would notice, like how you would define a true victim.
Hmm. How I would define a true victim.
Hmm.
Well, I would say a true victim is someone who earnestly feels that they've gone through some grievance and they feel it is like really important or substantive. It's not something trivial, and they want to connect with another person and express their pain to um, make it better or to form intimacy, to form like a symbiotic empathy versus somebody who is using the concept of victimhood in order to uh, play a power game or take control over somebody. Um, so I would define it like that, but it's not always so clear when something is one way or the other. And there might be cases where it's not strictly one or the other. It might be a little bit of both. Like, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Good
I
definition.
don't know if you think that's a good definition or not, but that's how I would.
Mm.
Yeah.
It's helpful because it helps illuminate something, right? Like there when we're talking and when you're talking about victims, you talked about two things. There's one is like what has happened to someone. Um, and the other is how are they expressing themselves? And what's interesting in this is like I have friends who have been really horribly abused and they don't express themselves as victims. They don't see themselves as victims. They see themselves as survivors. If they've been victims of rape, for instance, they would call
Hmm.
themselves survivors of rape. They see themselves as people that have just had a colored past. They see themselves as people that have defined themselves as they are now. So one part of it is like whether or not someone sees themselves as a victim of their circumstance and when they find it useful to express it or not. Um, so there's like what has actually happened to someone. And it is complicated because like our um our traumas are relative to ourselves less than they're relative to other people. So for some people, they've been a victim of the system if they've been fired from one job, and other people are like, being fired from one job is normal. I'm a victim of the system because I've been fired from 6 jobs in a row because of my race. And both people think they're a victim because relative to their own experience and relative to the experience of those around them, they are. Maybe the first person has never had anyone around them to get fired from a job, so even though they're white and relatively privileged and it was their fault, they still feel like a victim.
Hmm.
Um, so one thing I think it's useful to recognize is that you can't necessarily say this person is a victim or isn't a victim because it's it's based on their own experience. However, to the second part, there are more or less useful ways that people express themselves as victims, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it comes back to this question of what is true. So it's, you know, for them it might be true that they're a victim, but it may not be true in wider society. Like, okay, you got told that you did something wrong. Probably most people would agree that that's not a reason to go screaming on social media that you're a victim for somebody that, you know, said you shouldn't have put the coffee cup on the table, whatever it is.
Hmm.
Um, and then like what is it necessary for? Like, why are you speaking about being a victim? What is the goal of that? And if the goal is just that you want to get attention and you want to kind of boost your own voice, that's where things get complicated, right? I think most of us agree that that's not a very good goal. To put a broad term on it, it's like it only benefits you. It's
Hmm.
possible to say that you're a victim and to elevate your voice, you know, because you're wanting to like stand for like, okay, during the Me Too movement, for instance, when people were telling their stories in order to, I think, stay like create solidarity with other people who had had the same experience.
Hmm.
Um, it ended up becoming like going over the top, and people ended up being accused of things that really ruined their careers and that may not, in retrospect, have been worthy of ending their careers. But also, I think the reason a lot of those women were speaking up was like, okay, solidarity and speaking their experience for the first time and trying to create a cultural norm of these stories actually being told. Um, the other thing to notice is how much of someone's identity rests on being a victim. If
Hmm.
somebody's whole identity is that they are a victim of this thing, they're defining their identity against something rather than for it. And
Hmm.
that can be dangerous because then you can't really attack their point of view. You can't be like, objectively speaking, I don't think you were as much of a victim as, for instance, this person over here, because they're like, no, my identity is this. You can't break that down. Um, yeah.
Do you think there's ways to break that down, like earnestly, like not to with the intention of tearing them down, but so they can rethink it to be more objective themselves to benefit them with the
Totally.
end goal? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. The thing to not do, and I'll make one more uh distinction here. Two types of arguments, information-based arguments and value-based arguments. If someone is arguing information, you can come back at them. If they're like, I am a victim because this thing, and you're like, actually, I have information that tells you that that thing is incorrect. And they go, oh, I didn't have that information. Cool, I'm going to drop that argument. That's an information-based argument.
Hmm.
Probably like maybe 5 to 10% of arguments are purely information-based, and they're usually among mathematicians. The other rest of the arguments are more value-based, where if you say, actually, I have information that shows that's not true, the other person is like, how dare you? I didn't ask for that information, and also my view is valid, and it was subjective anyways, and like, you're a terrible person, whatever. Because they're not talking about the content.
Hmm.
They're coming from a concern. So the thing to do then is not to give them more information from your point of view, because they're not open to it. It's like you're trying to talk through an opening that doesn't exist. What you need to do first is to validate their point of view and then get curious and let them hang themselves on that rope. So first, like, hey, I hear that you had an experience that occurred as really difficult to you. And I imagine that it was scary and overwhelming. I hear you questioning if you're the only one with that experience. And I'm wondering, like, have you heard of other people having the same experience? Like, what has happened when you've told this to other people? Uh, who who are you with this experience, like, in you? Like, how has it changed you? So asking questions to help somebody take a look outside of their current frame, like not just this point of time, like not just tell me what happened. How do you feel about what happened? Like that's getting them more in and taking them more into their own context. But if instead you ask things like, who has this made you? And who else do you know who's had similar experiences? And like, what do you want for the world based on this experience? Like things to make them think outside of their box. It
Hmm.
it tends to make them think about things that they're not right now because they're very kind of sucked into one particular viewpoint. So that's the way that I do it. And usually people on their own recognize like, or, things like what effect do you want to have on other people from telling your story? What effect do you think you're having on other people? Would you like to hear what the impact is on me? Like
Hmm.
force them out of their own head.
And something else that I think that has been lost often in these conversations is the acknowledgement, or yeah, the acknowledgement of intentions. People don't really care about, or at least some people don't care about intentions. They just care about how something they heard made them feel, not the intentions of the other person. So
Right.
how do we bring that back into, because that's fundamental to almost everything, um when we assess, like, anything from crime to should I stay in a relationship with this person. But then when we're interacting with someone we don't know, like a stranger or someone on social media, someone might make an argument, whether it's values based or information based, and they say, I don't like that because I don't agree with that. But really, that person's intention is just to give you a different perspective so you can find out at least maybe some common ground or some synthesis and say, or say, your version is not the only truth. There's other truths out there. There's people of your identity category that have different experiences than yours. And it's not necessarily an assault on their subjective experience as an individual. It's trying to separate I guess, the notion of suffering from your identity, because we all suffer regardless of our identity, and to anchor it to a political framing. Obviously sometimes it can be very important, but sometimes it can be very narrow, and it can leave things out of the equation that are important. So how do you think we can, like, bring that, like, back in, um intention,
Bring the
like the
the focus on
importance or
intention.
the emphasis on of intentions of other people versus just how something sounds, or the
Mm.
outcomes of, you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. So, uh, like, couple thoughts on this. For one thing, the people's intentions in being on social media are different, right? Like some people are on social media to search for truth, to come up with new ideas, to get people's perspectives on their ideas. Some people are on social media as like a pastime. They want to debate things. They want to like kind of just enjoy uh kind of showing other people up or enjoy debating a good argument and playing the devil's advocate. I have someone in one of my communities who does this all the time. I continuously have to send him Facebook messages being like, so that thing that you said, probably not having the effect you want. Here's how it landed for me. You might want to edit it. I am
Hmm.
actually that person who sends those messages.
Yeah.
Um, so one thing is like, uh, you may think that you are posting something in order to get ideas and seek truth, but the reasons other people may be coming to your post in the first place may not match up.
Hmm.
Um, so that's one thing. And when attacked with something, it can be really good to go, okay, here was my intention in posting this or in saying this. This is what I was looking for. Instead of digging in to share your view more, just kind of reveal that. Like, oh, you didn't agree with that viewpoint. Well, I shared it because I wanted to get an discussion started about this thing, or I shared
Hmm.
it because I wanted to get perspectives on this, or I shared it because like I feel like it's an underrepresented view right now, and I really want to get it out there more. The next thing that can be really useful is to ask for input or make an offer. Like, I
Hmm.
would love to hear if you have different information than me. Can you cite some of it so that I can see it?
Hmm.
Um, I had this, I had this at one point recently where someone, I think it was on one of the articles that I wrote about like victim self and victim consciousness. Someone commented, obviously without reading the article, like, wow, it seems like this is quite intolerant of people that have different worldviews and less privileged identities. And then someone
I
else
did
was
not get
actually
that
like,
impression from part one or part two of your victim.
right.
Talk.
Like I'm
Yeah.
pretty careful to
Yeah.
try to
Yeah.
like actually
Yeah. Yeah.
caveat it a little bit of
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
you know,
That's
but that was the like they read the title of the article and they commented based on that. And then someone else commented on that to back them up and be like, yeah, I also think that this is a pretty insensitive article to write. And so my response was like, hey, I hear your point of view on that, and I'm totally aware that there may be some things that I've missed because I don't share your identity. I knew one of the people commenting was like Hispanic, probably had a different experience than me. I was like, I don't share your identity. I would love it if you read the article and want to give me any advice on how to improve it and make it kinder. I will give you a free subscription to my Substack so that you can read the article without the paywall.
hmm.
No follow-up, but that person like acted the next time I saw him, he was extremely friendly to me.
But don't you think it's important sometimes to separate or take identity out of the, well, I guess in that case, the person's bringing their identity in the argument, so you can't really, uh, but let them know their individual experience or subjective, whatever their issue is, might have nothing to do with their identity group. It just has to do with them as a person, and they might be justified in feeling that way, but it's not as anchored to, I guess, narrow conceptions of identity. Um,
Yes.
how do
The
you,
the goal
yeah, go ahead.
My goal when I'm having a tough conversation with someone is as much as possible give them nothing they can hit.
Hmm.
Like don't try not to put up walls that they can push back against unless you know this is someone that will enjoy that type of argument. Like you have trust built, you're like, cool, we can like go back and forth with each other, we can challenge each other's views. Like that is the thing I know we can do together. Fine, have fun with it. But if you're arguing with someone and there's any stakes to the conversation, like your social reputation might be at risk, or you don't know how they argue, you're in a social context, leading
Hmm.
with um, questions is often really good.
Hmm.
Asking them to explain their viewpoint so that they see the logical fallacies in it.
Yeah.
Like, can you tell me more about that? Is just a great question. And then, if they kind of start going in a direction you want, stopping and being like, can you tell me experiences you've had in your identity that you think I might not be like citing in my work, like basically like, hey, I want to hear the information that you have that I don't. And then like you're kind of in the clear in a way if you do that. And most people, especially if you're asking them to do extra work, they just won't do it. So you've kind of like in a weird way absolved yourself. If you feel like it's harming something, if they're like, well, this is an identity that all Black people hold and I hold it as well. Um, I have a Jamaican friend that pushes back really strongly on that. She's like, this is not the Black experience. I do not have this experience. There is no
Yeah.
unified Black experience. Um, if you think it's really hurtful to a particular group in the way that it's being formed, uh, I think that, might be something that you could say in the form of like, hey, like I have talked to other friends about this, and one of them has said like this is their perspective on it, especially if you have time to go talk to a couple of people to check whether that argument is true. Or you can be like, what tells you that that's the experience of all Black people? Um, or like, um, maybe even sharing like, hey, for me, I worry that some people's experience is going to be left out by that. And I'm curious, like, are there other experiences that you have heard of people having? But again, I'm trying to lead with questions because the other person really can't push back as much when you do that.
Yeah, I think the Jamaican thing is interesting. I've noticed that too. Being in Toronto, it has the largest population, I think, of Jamaicans outside of Jamaica, other than maybe London, UK. It might be. I think there's this meme in Jamaican culture that's quite useful. It's called or this phrase that they say, out of one, many people. So that's the concept that because yes, they were like taken there and uh, colonialized and colonized, whatever. There were different groups. There were the Asians, the Africans, the Indians from India, and the indigenous people there, and there was this. I'm just pointing out that I think there's this useful meme in their culture that emerged that did not emerge in like the African American experience, at least, that I think um, led to a difference in how um, I guess those cultures saw themselves in relation to others. Um, but I don't want to sidetrack too much or have like a sidebar conversation on that. But to get more back on victimhood more generally, something
Mhm.
I thought about as we were speaking is when you're talking about people reframing themselves as, let's say, for an example, survivors. Um, I think that obviously has some utility, but do you think it can lead to people denying their victimhood outright and not dealing with the emotions that are there, and then it ends up getting pent up and becoming more pathological later down the road, or more consequentially could possibly lead them, because they're so strong and stoical, to see someone else who's having a hard time genuinely being a victim of something and say, oh, you just need to toughen up, pull yourself up from your bootstraps. And I think that can be the danger of like being too involved in the reframing aspect. And then you can, like, I think pride and shame can be obviously being shame and having shame and being a victim is like bad because it's not your fault, and taking too much pride and being able to overcome something better than someone else could, or then that's almost like narcissistic and lacking empathy and maybe not even fully self-aware. Maybe you're not as over it as you think you are. So how do you think we navigate something like that? Sorry if I went on a bit too much, but go ahead.
No, I think you're not so much asking a question as just pointing at a good dichotomy. Like
Yeah.
people respond really differently to trauma. And some people haven't gotten to the point yet or don't have the tools to go, hey, a thing happened to me that really sucked. And maybe it would happen to someone else and they'd have a really different experience. It doesn't matter. I still had a really bad experience about it. And I can choose what to do with that. And some folks like aren't at the point where they can kind of process it through and feel into, well, what effect does that have on me? Like, I got uh a couple, like probably like 2 years ago now, had two of my major collaborators suddenly kind of turn on me. Like one
Hmm.
of them that I'd worked with for several years at that point was kind of my closest collaborator, almost like family, told me I was an unethical cult leader and cut me off, wouldn't like tell me what I was doing that was unethical cult leading.
And then some
Uh,
guy tell you, I declare peace on you, or was that
oh
just a
yeah,
crazy random? That was just a
yeah.
crazy random person.
That
Yeah.
didn't bug me as much. Yeah, it was somebody that was in like a pretty severe manic phase. But that it wasn't someone that close to me. So in that case, it like with strangers, I don't care. I've been told that often enough. I think if you're a relatively public personality, you have people being like, aha, a convenient target.
Yeah.
Um, but in this case, it was someone really close to me, and then it happened in a different version with one of my housemates, not around being an unethical cult leader, but just being told like you hurt people. And like in both scenarios, probably a grain of truth in what they said, but also it felt like they were acting out of something else. Um, and it really devastated me. And it took me a whole year to come back from. Like, at least. Like, I didn't want to be in the public eye. I didn't want to lead anything. I was questioning myself. I was like, well, what if I actually did do those things? How do I even check myself? How do I see things that are obviously outside of my consciousness? How would I know if I was being unethical and harming people? I tried to get feedback from people around me. Their feedback was positive. I was like, is everyone else lying to me? So it's like, um, I could say on one hand, oh, I'm being a victim of slander. I could say on another hand, like I am a survivor of like public ridicule and abuse. I
Yeah.
could say, I am someone that has had tough interactions with people that I trusted. Like I can put any of those labels on it. Fundamentally, the question is like, when I talk about it, there's like, what do I do with it? But there's when I talk about it, for what, how am I representing it and for what purpose am I talking about it? And how am I trying to make it part of my identity? Whereas for me, I'd say the way it's become part of my identity is like recognizing that I have to make a choice about like, I can't control other people's perceptions of me. So do I decide to be public anyways? And how do I open myself to feedback?
Is
Um,
it
that's kind of where it led me.
is it hard the being public? Um, Obviously you feel it's worth it, or you get something out of it, and you're giving to the world, obviously, tremendously. So did what do you think the hardest part of especially with your content more than some people's, it's very vulnerable. You're sharing very personal things. Um, w what's it like to have that attacked, or like, because I've experienced that too on a much smaller scale than you, because I'm not really known, at least not yet. Um, but I've certainly in my communities had people misunderstand things, and then I'm someone with the habit of trying to over explain myself when there's a misunderstanding, and sometimes that doesn't help. That just pisses people off more. So
Been
I'm
talking
just
about.
wondering how you manage it at your level. And I know you were basically talking about that, so
Yeah.
it might seem like a repetitive question, but what my question is, well, you, when people are trying to tear other people down, I think a lot of the time it's something akin to tall poppy syndrome or some jealousy complex or something. And sometimes people are trying to tear down people for legitimate reasons, although I still don't think it's right. You should tear down ideas, not people, for the most part. Um,
Hmm.
so how do you deal with bad faith actors in this like space?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I feel lucky to have been a facilitator and community leader for long enough that I got enough feedback to start being able to develop my own heuristics around it. Like, I think most people, when they get feedback, they're like, oh my gosh, I must be a bad person, or oh my gosh, this person must be a bad person. But when you get enough of it for long enough, you're like, okay, there are some like norms in this. Like for me, people were usually intimidated by me. And I was like, I don't feel intimidating. Like, you're having all sorts of reactions to me where you feel I'm unapproachable. I'm going to kick you out of this community. I'm intimidating. And after a while, I was like, oh, this is people's reactions to power. It's not necessarily reactions to me. Like, I did high status behaviors when I was leading, and that occurred as intimidating to people, even if I felt very approachable. So, um, when I get feedback from people now, it affects me more if it's someone close to me, but usually I'll kind of treat it um like a research project almost, where I'm like, okay, this person has told me, for instance, I get feedback sometimes that I'm unprofessional. I'm like, okay, people tell me I'm unprofessional. The first thing I want to ask is like, what would professional look like? Like, what are you noticing? I want to gather data to figure out like what is the thing you're seeing so I can check it against my own experience. That's step one. Just like somebody gives you hard feedback, bleh, ask them more about it. Because it de-escalates, it wins some trusts with them. You can do it in the moment, even if you're really triggered. Most of the time you can just be like, oh wow, can you say why you feel that? Can you name a moment for me? Whatever it is. And then you've got some data. Um, and then if other people give you that feedback, you can kind of keep asking them to get more information, decide if it's a thing that you want to change, or you work on it in yourself. I'm like, at this point, I'm like, wow, I would really love to be professional. I want to work with companies. It hurts when I like do my absolute best and I still get feedback that I'm unprofessional. And I haven't fully been able to figure out why, despite asking for input. So at that point, I'm like, I can sit and have feelings about this, or I can decide if these are the people I want to be working with and the place I want to be working. If they're not going to change, do I want to keep putting myself in that situation? Um, or with those people, do I want to do something different? Do I want to find different people? Because we're kind of only in control of our own space.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's kind of general, so if you have a specific example, I'm open to it.
Oh, sorry, a specific example of which? Like,
Of that, like, feedback you could get that then you'd have a hard time taking in and um
no, I don't, but I am curious, moving on from that a little bit, going back to victim, just want to stay on that a moment more. Um, my I kind of already went over this a little bit, but my biggest concern as a result of the backlash to victim culture is that people are gonna lose empathy and compassion for legitimate grievances of all kinds, whether it has to do with the Black experience or whatever experience, and we won't be able to call out legitimate cases of racism because it'll be uh cover like just oversaturated with a bunch of fake instances or over exaggerated incidences, and then we won't be able to actually weed out anything anymore. And I think this is where sense making comes in, and that community. And I think that there are legitimate way or there are modes of suffering in which we can all experience or potentially experience that aren't anchored to identity. like poverty. I mean, I guess that can be anchored to an identity of class, but even like, and I think disability even can be wrongfully categorized as like an identity because I mean there can be a culture around that, and I guess disability issues have been somewhat like wokified for better or worse. Um, but I would say it's a category error oftentimes to put something like uh disability in with something like gender or race because um disability to me is more something like poverty. It functions on like a continuum, and there's different kinds, and anybody can wake up and be disabled. They can have a stroke in their sleep, they could get hit by a bus, they could be diagnosed with ALS. There's all these things that can happen, and pe people often see themselves who are disabled now because I think of identity politics. Oh, I'm a disabled person rather than just a person. Obviously, I'm talking from like my firsthand experience as a disabled person and interacting with other people with disabilities. Um, I, I think where I'm going with this is, um, I think there are identities that 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 aren't rigid or something that you have to be born into, and then there's identities that you can just get. Like I was born with my disability, so in my case I'm born into it, but I think when it's an experience that anyone could potentially experience, it becomes a deeper experience than something that only a certain group can. And I'm not saying just because some person of a certain group experiences something and I could never experience that because I'm I'm never gonna wake up black. We shouldn't empathize with black people. That's not the point because the cultural momentum could shift and you can be treated like a black person if the power structure changes, and you can be treated different on the basis of your race. We've already seen that to some degree as a result of cultural shifts. Obviously it's still very bad for black people, but my point is, we instead of focusing on identity, not removing identity from the picture because it's important. And I think standpoint theory is very crucial, but I just think it needs to be informed by I guess like self-reflection and empirical data, and then we can say to one another, hey, any one of us could in this position would feel the same. And then we can go from that, and instead of talking about my identity is this, and because you're not this identity you can't speak to that. And I don't think that's a way of like bridging gaps or creating empathy. And I think so much empathy is lost, and because there's legitimate pushback against victim narratives, I also am concerned about the pushback leading to lack of empathy in society, so people can't even express victimhood at all anymore, and that will lead to even worse problems. So do you want to get into what your thoughts are on that, or just react to everything I said? Yeah.
It sounds like what the core of what you're speaking to is a concern that if um if identity becomes core to people's arguments and to their sense of victimhood, and everybody is shouting out all the time about their identity being victimized, and the categories of identity are becoming broader, which I think is happening. We can see that even in the way that autism is being diagnosed. And
Mhm.
like you're saying, the number of people that assume they have disabilities because now holding an identity for some reason has become like gratifying and rewarding instead of being like denigrated. Like we've had a flip in the perception of that. Instead of being disabled being something that's looked down upon, now like holding an identity is somehow considered cool. Um which I'll also say I think is in part because of the way that like TikTok has picked it up and identities are becoming a like one of the only ways that we can mark having community or social groups. There's a lot to it, but it seems like what you're saying is like, what if people are shouting so loudly about their identities in for small instances of aggression that the bigger ones get lost, like the
Yeah,
liberties that
that's
people
my
actually
biggest concern.
yeah.
Yeah. And I feel like while disability is given some attention by people in the social justice arena, it's often silly and they're arguing about things that don't really, or at least I would say don't really matter too much. Maybe some people think they matter, obviously, or it's or the important issues are just not being touched at all. I think disability is something that is often ignored, same way the dimension of class or poverty is often left out of discussion in social justice now. And we're only talking about two things, sometimes more, but basically gender and race. And that's it. And it's also like one dimensional too. Like I don't think something like intersectionality is wrong. It's just overly simplified. Intersectionality will work different in different social atmospheres. So your intersectionality of being this or that may privilege you, or I don't really like that word, advantage you or disadvantage you in different situations, but it's not universally true that this identity is always this and always that. And then we get in the oppressed and oppressor mindsets and all. I just I don't how do we I know we're kind of getting post woke now and we're getting into post cancel culture and it's not as bad. And I just don't like how the anti woke have like originally I really liked what they, well, it depends who you're talking about, but I liked what they were saying. But now it's almost gotten to the point where anytime anyone expresses a concern about something they're going through, oh my God, he's playing the victim card or she's playing the victim. Like I don't want that to be, that's not a very empathetic and loving society. That's not good, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've gone way over to the other side. How would you like disability to be treated, like in a just society? Like, how would you make distinctions between people that are on the far end of disability and needing help versus folks that are claiming it versus like how resources should be allocated to people with disability versus others?
So I just want to be clear on one thing. I wasn't saying that people with less obvious disabilities don't have disabilities. That I wasn't making a claim against people uh using disability the wrong, although that can happen. I was talking more about how we talk about it as a culture and the kind of issues we focus on. So if I
Mm-hmm.
guess for an example, if you're a disabled person and your primary concern is, not that it can't be a concern at all, obviously, but if your primary concern is if a disabled person gets to play a disabled role in Hollywood and not thinking about the practicalities of how many hours on set it takes and how it might not always be easy, or what if you have to portray a progression of a disease where they can do CGI. I mean, in some cases it might be possible, but you're talking about all these things. But the erroneous thing to me is not asking for more representation of real disabled people in film. It's attacking the actors that play the role of the disabled person, for an example, and saying that they're working against them when they're literally our allies, trying their best to empathize and understand our experience and trying to help us. They're not, and they're doing their job. It's acting as you're supposed to pretend to be other people. It's not offensive. I mean, if a movie is written a certain way that is problematic and people take offense to that, that's fine. But I don't like this idea that a trans person needs to be this portrayed like these things, and we should focus on, oh, maybe disabled people need more funding so they can get caregivers so they don't end up in care facility prematurely, or if it's otherwise avoidable, or how
Mhm.
can we get them more jobs?
We're not focusing on the actual thing, we're focusing on smaller representations, which happens in almost anything. Like we look at what's right in front of us, what seems easiest, and unless you're actually experiencing the problems, you're not, your voice isn't being represented, which to me what is why the most important thing is just like having an actually representative government of the people that are being represented. Like you have to have people, if you're leading a disability organization and you don't have people that are actively experiencing the downsides of disability, you can't you can't understand that experience.
Yeah, and I would say regardless of how representative a concern is, I'm not saying we can't speak about things that are less common or less concerning to most disabled people. But I just want to get the hostility out of conversations. And I've seen how the conversation with race and gender has gone. And I'm just afraid that things like disability will go down the same. They already have to some extent, but they haven't fully. So I just don't want disability issues and or any other issues, not just disability issues, to be captured by this purely identitarian kind of way of looking at things rather than looking at it as a mode of suffering or social disadvantage, physical suffering and limitation, or mental suffering and limitation, and then the social struggle on top of that of being perceived differently. How to reframe culture to see people who are uh, maybe have certain medical conditions or whatever, to not be viewed as a burden, or what, like I think a lot of stuff has to be like bottom up, like versus top down. Like I don't like a lot of political sometimes legislation is obviously necessary, but we need a cultural change fundamentally in how we perceive people. And if we perceive uh disabled people or as something like an exaggerated or unnecessary expression of grievance, just as we treat maybe some gender and race issues, then disabled people might not get the needs that they need to survive, basically. Whereas if you
Let me,
are
I
yeah,
wanna pause for just a second.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I just know that as you're a disabled person, this is obviously like a topic that affects you a lot. And I hear that what you're speaking
Sure.
to is like wanting for the real experience that you're having day in and day out to not be
Not just mine though,
overshadowed.
other people too.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yours and
yeah.
others. Folks that are like legitimately being affected every day by the condition they're in, both socially and when it comes to access to resources, that you don't want that to get drowned out by people that
Mhm.
are claiming an identity and claiming access to resources that are necessarily limited. Um, does that feel true to what you're speaking about?
Mhm.
Or yeah,
You nailed it on the head, much to the point. Yeah,
yeah.
that's exactly it. I think also class and poverty. I've never experienced poverty, but I've experienced uh debt and stuff. But I think a lot of class issues are also um removed from conversation. We don't talk about class issues, and maybe it's starting to come back a little bit more, but I think that's probably even more crucial than the disability aspect, only because more people struggle as a result of class than disability. But obviously if you have a disability and you're of a certain class, let's say you're not upper class or upper middle class, it's going to be harder for you to ascend or to do well in life, because class issues can really hold you back. I'm lucky enough to live in Canada, so we have universal health care, but we still don't have a lot of programs and services that should be accessible that might be accessible in other countries, like in
In
Scandinavia.
America,
Yeah,
in
go ahead.
America, in America, I think oftentimes like we even look at things like skin color as a stand-in for class. We're like, oh, Black people are oppressed because they tend to be less affluent and less privileged than white people, but then we don't actually privilege, for instance, poor white people who may have even less money or opportunities than
Hmm.
Black people. I think oftentimes what we're looking at in terms of inequality is a class divide. It's not necessarily a racial divide. I mean, there are other issues that come along and other prejudices that come along with skin color, but that's one of the biggest things. I noticed that we have kind of shifted context into
Yeah,
having
we kind
a
of
discussion, which
I
is
kind of derailed. I'm sorry if I did that. I didn't mean to make this podcast all about me or but if you'd like to go back on track to some of the questions I have, we can do that if you like.
well, I only have
Yeah.
5 more minutes until I have
Okay.
another call.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah, sorry, I lost track of time. Okay, that's fine. Go ahead.
do you have a last question that you want to ask or any way that you want to wrap up?
Um, let me think about that. So do you want to talk about, I guess, like earned status versus performed, but this is still on the same subject matter, or do you want to shift to something else completely? It's really up to you.
I think that's going to take us in a little bit of a different direction. I think maybe instead we just do a wrap up since there's only a couple minutes left.
Okay, that's fine. Um,
Um,
yeah,
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 it seems like we've covered ground to a number of different topics, largely like victim identity and how that shows up in society and how it shows up in both of our own lives. I really appreciate you sharing about your own experience with it, which is something that
yeah, and sometime if you do ever want to come back on, we can talk about your experience with it. I know you've been open about your mental health and stuff you've dealt with. So if you ever want to get into that, we can do that, or we can shift the conversation to more general topics. I really enjoyed our chat. And thank you for your time.
yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
setting it up.